She was pregnant, surrounded by luxury, and married to a billionaire everyone admired. But behind the perfect image was a brutal truth. Her husband had already planned to replace her, erase her, and turn her life into a business transaction. What he didn't expect was that she was watching, learning, and preparing to fight back. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about waking up, reclaiming your power, and proving that even when you're underestimated, you can still win. The lesson? Never ignore the red flags. Never let anyone reduce your worth. And when life pushes you down, rise smarter, not louder. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like and share to support the channel. Your support is the motivation for us to bring more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Alara was standing in the cavernous, sterile lobby of her husband's new corporate headquarters, whispering a promise to the unborn child nestled beneath her heart when she first felt the cold prickle of doubt. 200 of San Francisco's tech elite milled around her, but not one of them saw the truth. Not one of them cared. Her husband, Julian Croft, the billionaire founder of Ether Dynamics, was holding court by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his charismatic smile a weapon he wielded with precision. Beside him was Isabel Rourke, his chief operating officer, a woman with eyes as sharp and unforgiving as cut glass. They looked like a power couple. They looked perfect. Julian had given Alara his old company tablet to control the lighting for the art installation she was curating for the launch party. "It's a relic, darling, but it'll do the job," he'd said. It was on that relic, in a supposedly wiped folder, that she found it. Not love letters, not scandalous photos. It was a document titled Continuity Protocol, a corporate contingency plan, a blueprint for transferring a controlling interest in the company to Isabel in the event of Julian's legal separation. Her breath hitched. The chatter of 200 guests faded into a dull roar. Her life, her marriage, her child, they were all line items in a business strategy. 2 days later, alone in that same empty lobby, she would uncover the rest of the plan. A calculated betrayal so deep it would threaten to shatter everything. She hadn't inherited an empire. She had woken up to find herself an obstacle in one. The document was just the beginning. Deeper in the tablet's ghost memory, she found synced travel itineraries. A conference in Tokyo, a summit in Berlin, Julian and Isabel in adjoining penthouse suites, registered under corporate pseudonyms. Encrypted expense reports detailing dinners that cost more than Alara's first car, filed under client acquisition. It wasn't a passionate affair, it was a merger. Isabel wasn't just the other woman. She was the designated successor to Julian's life, and Alara was the liability being managed. But that isn't the real story. The real story is what happened after the discovery, when Alara, 6 months pregnant and underestimated by everyone, decided not to be a victim. It's the story of how she used her knowledge of art, of nuance and hidden meanings, to dismantle a fortress of lies built with code and contracts. It's the story of how a titan's own trap, designed to protect his assets, would ultimately ensnare everyone who thought she was just a pretty decoration in his perfect life. The fog had rolled in off the bay for 3 days, swallowing the skyline, as if the city itself knew a storm was brewing inside the glass tower of Ether Dynamics. The tech partners, in their minimalist designer suits, the venture capitalists who owed Julian their fortunes, the society bloggers whose loyalty was as fleeting as their Instagram stories, they all saw a fairy tale. Julian Croft, the brilliant visionary, and his beautiful, artistic wife, Alara. They didn't see the 16-hour workdays that had become Julian's norm, nor the way his eyes would glaze over when she talked about her gallery. They didn't see Isabel Rourke, who had joined the company 3 years ago, and in a slow, methodical creep had inserted herself into every corner of their lives. Alara had tried to be her friend. Isabel was charming, whip-smart, and always ready with a compliment that felt, in retrospect, like a subtle probe for weaknesses. "Julian is so lucky to have you," she'd say. "It must be so hard for you to keep up with this world." She whispered into the cold air of the lobby, a promise to her baby. "I'm sorry I was so blind. I'm sorry I believed him when he said I was being paranoid. The tablet in her hands felt heavy, not with its own weight, but with the weight of years of calculated deception. She remembered Julian brushing off her concerns. His late nights with Isabel were war room sessions. Their weekend trips were investor meetings. Her loneliness was her not understanding the pressure he was under. He made her feel small, irrational. She watched as Isabel's influence grew, her opinions becoming Julian's opinions, her strategies becoming company policy. She watched as their shared private jokes became impenetrable walls, leaving Alara on the outside looking in. She was the crack in their perfect corporate sidewalk, something to step around and forget. No one helped her. Not one person in their glittering social circle ever questioned the narrative. So Alara stood up, the ache in her lower back a constant reminder of the new life she was protecting. She walked past the empty pedestals where her curated art would soon stand, past the conference rooms named after pioneers of science, past every symbol of the empire her husband had built, an empire he was now leveraging against her. She didn't confront him, she didn't break down. She walked out of that building and into the foggy San Francisco night, not as a wife betrayed, but as a rival preparing for war. She drove to her small, quiet art studio across the city. The air smelled of turpentine and clay, a world away from the sterile, metallic scent of ether dynamics. There, under the soft glow of a single lamp, she began to push, not in anger, but with the focus of an artist shaping her masterpiece. She dug deeper into the tablet's files, cross-referencing calendars with credit card statements she'd long had access to but never thought to inspect. It wasn't a slap to the face. It was a quiet, cold blade slipping between her ribs. The pain was in the details. The purchase of a Cartier bracelet from a jeweler in Geneva logged as promotional hardware. The lease on a discreet apartment in Nob Hill, paid for through a shell corporation. He wasn't just cheating. He was building a separate life, brick by expensive brick, right under her nose. "Thank you for the data, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice was steady, like a surgeon before the first incision. "Most people just lie. You documented everything." Most people weren't paying attention, but Alara was. She set the tablet down and pulled out a fresh canvas, not to paint, but to plan. The ring on her own finger, a simple platinum band Julian had given her when his company was just a dream operating out of a garage, felt cold against her skin. The blood rushing in her ears was the only sound in the studio. 200 people had celebrated her husband's success, and not one had seen his treachery. Not a gasp, not a whisper. Nothing. Isabel stood beside him, poised and triumphant, her hand still metaphorically raised from the corporate blow she had dealt. Her voice echoed in Alara's memory from a board meeting she'd attended months ago. "We must eliminate all non-essential assets." Alara now knew she was the primary non-essential asset. She touched her belly, her fingers tracing the curve. A quiet promise without anger, without tears. He needed a partner, she thought, and he chose the wrong one. Nobody defended her because nobody knew she was under attack. 200 people saw a pregnant, supportive wife at a corporate party. Every single one of them chose the comfortable illusion. Alara didn't know it yet, but her quiet strength was being watched, not by a person, but by the digital trail they had left behind. And that trail, like a line of spilled ink, was about to stain everything it touched. 8 years earlier, a 24-year-old Alara stood in a dusty garage and held Julian Croft's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. He had just lost his first major investor. He was brilliant, passionate, and on the verge of giving up. He built worlds with code, and she was an art history student who saw the beauty in his algorithms. For 2 years after that failure, it was just Alara and Julian. He was the man who had yet to build a billion-dollar empire, who ate takeout with her on the floor of their tiny apartment, who sketched server architecture on napkins and dreamed of changing the world. The man made her terrible coffee every morning. He'd listen for hours as she talked about Impressionism. He showed up. He didn't have the right words for his own self-doubt, but he held her hand and he kept coding. Then success arrived. It came into their lives like a flash flood, all venture capital and breathless media profiles. With success came Isabel. She was 42, a legendary COO from Silicon Valley with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. She laughed at Julian's technical jokes. She streamlined his operations. She secured funding that Alara and Julian had only dreamed of. They hired her 6 months after Ether Dynamics' first major product launch. Alara was the one who encouraged it. She wanted him to have the best. She smiled for the magazine photos because he asked her to, and because she wanted him to be happy, even though something in her gut felt wrong, like a corrupted line of code that could crash the whole system. The changes came slowly, so slowly, Alara didn't recognize them as a coordinated attack. First, their weekly date night stopped. Julian said the Series B funding round required his complete focus, and Isabel was the only one who could navigate it. Alara was moved to a smaller office at the gallery she ran. Julian had bought the building and said the larger space was better suited for a commercial tenant. Isabel promised to help her find a better location. She never did. Then the conversations disappeared. Alara would come home from work to find Julian and Isabel still at the dining table, laptops open, talking in a language of projections and market caps she didn't understand. What Alara wouldn't learn for years was this: Isabel was intercepting more than just his time. Every concern Alara raised to Julian was reframed by Isabel as emotional stress. Every idea Alara had for the company's culture was dismissed as unscalable. Every attempt she made to reconnect with the man she married was blocked by a firewall of corporate priorities. Isabel replaced their intimacy with quarterly reports, and to Alara it felt like being phased out. Her husband stopped seeing her. He stopped asking about her art. She didn't know he was being told that she was unhappy with his success and feeling threatened by Isabel's competence. She didn't know her own marriage was being systematically dismantled by a hostile takeover. Julian asked Clara every single night about the nursery preparations, and Clara always gave the same answer. "It's coming along, darling. It just needs your final touch. You know how indecisive I get." To his mistress, Chloe, Julian told a different story. "She's so wrapped up in the baby, sweetheart, she barely notices I'm there. We have all the time in the world. That's a good thing, isn't it?" Then, with a darker, more thrilling edge, she wouldn't want to add any stress to the pregnancy. Clara stopped asking when he'd be home for dinner, stopped waiting up to hear his car in the driveway, stopped expecting to feel his hand on her swelling belly as she slept. She became a beautiful fixture in their sterile penthouse, a ghost haunting the minimalist spaces that used to feel full of promise, now echoing only with the hum of the city below. She was 7 months along when she saw it, an anniversary reminder on their shared family tablet. It wasn't for their anniversary. 2 simple words: a boutique hotel downtown. She'd given up her career as a gallery director, her small but vibrant apartment in the Arts District with its beautiful chaos and paint-splattered floors. She traded it for a life of managed perfection in a high-rise in Chicago. She kept one photo on her nightstand from their trip to Italy before the fortune was made, when he looked at her like she was the entire world, both of them laughing, both of them real. She hadn't felt that connection in 2 years when the notification chimed. The tablet lit up at 3:17 in the morning, an alert from a shared album she'd forgotten existed. Chloe's name, a picture of a diamond tennis bracelet on a slender wrist uploaded just minutes ago. The caption read, "He knows how to make a girl feel special. Happy anniversary, my love." Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, the city lights blurring through her tears. She didn't sob. She couldn't. There was a cold, hard knot forming in her chest, a knot that had been tightening for months, and crying would mean admitting that behind that knot was a foolish girl who believed in fairy tales. He was never coming back to her, not really, and now she knew why. The Foundation's annual gala was scheduled for 2 days later, not for charity, but because Julian Vance never missed an opportunity for good press. He used to say that optics make the man, they make people see what you want them to see. The invitation was a thick card on her dresser, an address on the Magnificent Mile, a start time, and a single line in script that read, "Your presence is my greatest asset." The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, smelling of expensive perfume and the faint metallic scent of ambition. Chloe arrived 20 minutes early. She always did. Influence started with being seen first, choosing the best vantage point, setting the stage, making everyone else revolve around her. She wore crimson red because she wasn't in mourning for anything. She was celebrating a victory. Her date was a junior executive who talked too much and understood too little. A perfect shield. Chloe was ready for this night to be her coronation. Clara arrived on time, wearing a simple navy blue dress that elegantly framed her baby bump. She'd managed to hide the puffiness around her eyes where the tears had finally come and then stopped. The bruise on her soul had faded from sharp agony to a dull, heavy ache. She hadn't bothered with much makeup. She found her table at the front, folded her hands over her belly, and didn't look for Julian. Didn't look at anyone. Her eyes settled on the massive ice sculpture in the center of the room, a swan, perfect and cold, slowly melting under the hot lights. She remembered Julian whispering to her once, years ago on a park bench. True character is how you treat someone who can do nothing for you. He used to say things like that, back when he helped old ladies with their groceries and remembered their doorman's birthday. Because it's the right thing to do, Clara, and that's when it counts. The room was buzzing. The CFO of Vance Innovations nodded at her from across the room. Two board members whispered as they looked at her belly. Chloe laughed at something her escort said. Then the main doors opened and her world cracked down the middle. Julian walked in. He wasn't alone. Chloe, her red dress like a warning signal, was on his arm. Not as a colleague, not as a guest. He held her hand. He moved with the kind of oblivious arrogance that comes from decades of getting exactly what you want, whenever you want it. He wore a tuxedo that was tailored to perfection, but his smile was cheap, rehearsed, and not for his wife. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room for cameras. The ambient chatter died in their immediate vicinity. He placed a kiss on Chloe's temple, right there in the doorway, and then he saw Clara. He looked at his 7 months pregnant wife with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and impatience. "My apologies for the delay, everyone," he said into the microphone on the stage, his voice smooth and practiced, a voice that had charmed investors out of billions and never betrayed a hint of unease. "My senior vice president, Chloe Astor, and I were just finalizing a key acquisition. Please, enjoy the evening." Chloe's smile was triumphant. Her eyes locked with Clara's across the room, a silent declaration of war. 6 months ago, Julian Vance had started coming home late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers. He called it the stress of a new product launch. He said it wasn't about intelligence, not about business, but about endurance. "Loyalty," he said, "is forged in fire." He'd paused, looking at her belly. "A test of our new chapter." He'd opened a bottle of champagne for himself. He said that a person's true nature reveals itself under pressure, when there's no easy answer, when doing the right thing feels like the hardest thing in the world. He looked at Clara then, but his eyes were distant. She looked back at him now, across the crowded ballroom, and something in her chest didn't just tighten, it shattered. It was the feeling of being utterly and completely erased. At the table, Chloe's hand rested on Julian's arm. 197 people were in that room, watching the drama unfold. One person stood up. One person left her seat, her glass of water untouched, and walked past every table of investors and rivals who were now whispering furiously. She walked right up to the stage, took the second microphone, and gave the speech of her life. Her voice didn't shake. "He's right," she said, looking not at Julian but at the audience. "Character is revealed under pressure. And my husband," she paused, letting the words hang in the air, "has just failed his test." She turned to Julian, whose face was a mask of fury. "And you," she said to Chloe, "can have the coat, but you'll never be the first lady." Clara's breath was steady. Her hand rested on her own belly. She slid her wedding ring off her finger and placed it on the lectern. "This is the final settlement of the Julian Vance estate," she announced, her voice ringing clear. "Executed tonight and witnessed by 200 of his closest friends and colleagues." She picked up the ring. The first line of her new life wasn't about a dollar amount, it was a declaration. "If you are hearing this, it means I chose self-respect when it would have been easier to look away. That self-respect belongs to me and my child. We are inheriting everything that matters." A gasp rippled through the ballroom. Not a scream, but a collective, sharp intake of breath from a room full of people who had just watched a multi-billion-dollar brand image get torched in 12 seconds. Chloe went white. The CFO, Marcus Webb, looked like he was about to be sick. The board members were already discreetly typing on their phones. Clara looked at Julian, whose hands were clenched into fists, his face a thundercloud of rage. Her voice was just a whisper now, meant only for him. "I don't understand. You barely even look at me anymore." Julian's expression turned venomous. "I looked at her every single day," he hissed, his voice low and brutal. "She knew exactly what I needed, and she spent the last year of our marriage making sure I got everything you couldn't give me." Chloe's voice cut in, high and sharp. "This is slander. This is a private matter. Our lawyers will be in touch." Clara didn't even look at her. She was still looking at Julian. "Your lawyers are welcome to try, Julian. But I should tell you, I anticipated that as well. I anticipated everything." The gala ended in chaos. Clara walked out, head held high. Marcus Webb made 3 calls before he even left the ballroom. Julian and Chloe were surrounded by a flurry of urgent whispers. Clara sat alone in a taxi for 20 minutes, holding her stomach, the city lights blurring past. The driver waited. When Clara finally gave him her old address, the one for her small apartment she'd kept just in case, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her old living room, the city noise a familiar comfort, with a cup of tea that went cold hours ago. She wasn't reading legal documents. She was looking at an old photo album, the one filled with pictures of a life she was finally ready to build for herself. Interlocking shell corporations and offshore accounts. A financial labyrinth, clearly built to keep people out. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating with calls from unknown numbers and emails from attorneys and board members who had ignored her for a decade. She silenced them all and dialed Maya. "So," Maya's voice crackled through, "you're a billionaire now." "I suppose," Alara replied, the words feeling foreign. "I don't quite grasp the mechanics of it. It works like this. You're buying me dinner tomorrow. I want the 7-course tasting menu at the French Laundry, with the wine pairing, and one of those ridiculous gold leaf desserts." Alara almost managed to laugh. Almost. "Maya, I'm terrified." A brief pause, then Maya's voice softened. "I know, sweetie, but you are the toughest woman I know. You have me, and you have that little girl inside you who's about to enter the world with the most formidable mother on the West Coast." "I haven't told anyone about the baby. I know. But you will, when you're ready." Alara rested a hand on her stomach. The baby stirred, a soft flutter like the turning of a page. The very next day, the demolition of her life began. Alara came home from a long day at the museum archives to find a bright orange condemnation notice plastered on the lobby door of her historic apartment building. 72 hours to vacate, no reason given, no recourse offered. The building had been sold 2 weeks prior to a shell company named Sterling Legacy Holdings. Alara didn't need to investigate who was behind it. She collapsed onto her bed, reading the notice again and again. 5 months pregnant, with just over $800 in her bank account and nowhere to live. The following morning, she was summoned to her director's office at the museum. Dr. Albright, the man who had hired her 3 years ago, calling her a brilliant historical mind, sat behind his desk looking ashen. "Alara, I am so sorry. We've had to make some immediate organizational changes. Your department is being digitized and dissolved." Alara just stared. "My department? The entire historical archives?" Dr. Albright refused to meet her gaze. "I'm so sorry." Alara walked out in a daze past the grand entrance hall. A newly installed digital donor screen was flashing, celebrating a massive new contribution and a new chair of the board, Serafina Sterling. A $2 million donation dated 3 days before the organizational changes were announced. Her home condemned, her career erased, 5 months pregnant. In less than 48 hours, Serafina had bulldozed every foundation Alara had carefully built. But Serafina's campaign wasn't over. That evening, there was a knock on her apartment door. Expecting Maya, she opened it to find Julian Croft in the hallway, holding a ridiculously expensive bouquet and wearing a look of rehearsed sincerity. Julian! The man she'd loved for 2 years, the man she had called late one night, her voice trembling, to tell him she was pregnant. The man who had sat across from her in a sterile coffee shop looked her dead in the eye and said, "This isn't part of my 5-year plan, Alara. This isn't what I want." Then he walked out. No calls, no texts. He wasn't there for the first ultrasound, when she had to grip the sides of the chair to keep from shaking, as the technician pointed to the tiny, flickering heartbeat on the screen. And now here he was, smelling of money and ambition, with that carefully crafted smile. "Ilara," he said, stepping into the doorway, "I heard about the funeral, about your father. I am so sorry." "What do you want, Julian?" "I made a mistake, a colossal one." I panicked. The baby, the timing, it was too much. But I've had time to think, and I want to be here. For you. For our baby. Alara studied his face, truly studied it, and saw the performance. The slight flicker in his eyes when he mentioned her father, the almost imperceptible pause before the word mistake as he selected it from his script. He had no idea her home was being taken, no idea she'd lost her job. He only knew about the inheritance. "Julian," she said, her voice flat, "you told me I didn't fit your trajectory. You left me in a cafe and then you blocked my number. You watched me fall apart and you walked away. And now you appear with a bouquet from the ferry building because you heard my father's name in the Wall Street Journal. Alara, that's not fair. The door is that way." He reached for her arm, a possessive, confident gesture. She pulled back as if burned. He opened his mouth to protest, but she slammed the door, shot the deadbolt, and leaned against it until the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. Then she sank to the hardwood floor. At 2 a.m, Alara was curled up on her bathroom floor, hugging her knees, choking on sobs so deep they stole her breath. She'd lost her home, her job. The father of her child was a vulture circling a fresh kill. Her own father was gone, and his widow was waging a scorched earth campaign against her. $500 billion sat frozen in accounts she couldn't touch, couldn't use to fix any of this. She laid a hand on her stomach, her whisper raw. "I don't know how I'm going to do this." The baby gave a gentle kick, a tiny, reassuring pressure against her palm, as if to say, "I'm right here. You're not alone." Serafina's legal assault was immediate. Within a week, she filed a formal challenge to the will, retaining Marcus Thorne, a corporate litigator famous for turning impossible cases into brutal victories. Alara's previous lawyer was let go in a phone call that lasted less than 15 seconds. The challenge rested on a 3-pronged attack. First, that Alara had been estranged from her father for years. Therefore, the will was the product of a dying man's emotional delusion. Second, that Alara, a quiet academic, had zero business acumen and was profoundly unfit to helm a $500 billion global enterprise. And third, the accusation Serafina polished like a knife in the dark, that Elias Vance, the estate's executor, had exerted undue influence on his ailing friend. The hearing was set before Judge Patricia Cole, 63 years old with 28 years on the bench. She was known for her fierce intellect and an absolute allergy to courtroom drama. She once held a tech billionaire in contempt for sighing too loudly during a deposition. She was precisely the kind of judge Serafina should have feared. The courtroom was a media circus, with camera crews lining the walls. This was the most significant probate case in California history, and the city was hungry for the spectacle. Alara sat with Elias at their table, wearing a simple forest green dress Maya had found, professional enough for court, but loose enough to conceal the slight curve of her belly. Her hands were clasped calmly on the table. She felt anything but calm. Serafina was seated across the aisle in a stark white suit, her expression a masterclass in elegant grief. Thorne sat beside her, exuding a lethal patience, a man who knew legal battles were won with carefully laid minds, not loud explosions. He presented his case with surgical precision, painting Alara as a resentful opportunist who ignored her father and his life's work, only to emerge from the shadows to claim a prize she couldn't possibly comprehend. He cited her modest archivist's salary, her rented apartment, her complete lack of corporate experience. He made it all sound so logical, which is what made it so terrifying. Then he called his star witness. Elara heard the name before her brain could process it. The defense calls Julian Croft. Ice flooded her veins. Julian strode to the witness stand in a tailored suit she'd never seen. He was sworn in. He took his seat. He refused to look at Elara. Thorne's questions were like scalpels. "Mr. Croft, how long were you in a romantic relationship with Miss Vance?" 2 years. "And during that time, did she ever bring up her father's fortune?" "Frequently. She was fixated on the money. She often said she was entitled to a piece of the empire, that it would all be hers someday." Elara's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Did she ever mention a strategy for reconnecting with her father? She said she was waiting for the perfect moment. She wanted to reestablish herself in the family before his health declined further. She called the inheritance her safety net. Every word was a poisoned dart. Elara had never once discussed her father's money with Julian. She had barely spoken of her father at all because the grief was a private, sacred wound. Julian knew that. He had held her while she cried over their estrangement. He had seen the one single photograph she kept on her bedside table and had asked why only one, and she had told him it was all her heart could handle. Now, under oath, he was twisting every shared intimacy into a weapon. Thorne moved in for the kill. "Mr. Croft, in your estimation, was Miss Vance's pregnancy a calculated decision?" "It was a calculated move. She knew it now. Serena telling him she wanted a family, planting the seed of a legacy he could build with someone who understood his ambition. The idea must have been intoxicating." The ballroom buzzed with tech industry chatter, but for Clara, all sound had collapsed into a high-pitched whine. She could see the narrative taking shape, the invisible bond between her husband Leo and his protégée Serena. Coded messages on encrypted apps, hushed promises in the glass-walled conference rooms of his empire. Her most private hopes for their future, her pregnancy, had been twisted into something he shared with someone else. She wanted to shatter the champagne flute in her hand, to stand on the table and expose Leo Vance as a fraud and a coward. She wanted to scream that the only thing calculated about her pregnancy was her fierce, primal love for the child inside her. But her friend Maya's hand grazed her elbow, a feather-light touch that meant asterisk not here, asterisk. The announcer called Leo to the stage. Clara made it to the marble-clad powder room just as the first sob escaped. She braced herself against the cool stone, pressing her palm to her mouth to muffle the sound. Her body trembled, and the baby inside her kicked. A sudden, sharp protest, as if it sensed its mother's agony and wanted to lash out at the source. Maya found her there. She didn't offer platitudes. She just slid down to the floor, her silk gown pooling around her, a silent, steady presence. She waited until Clara's ragged breaths evened out. "He's a fool," Maya said, her voice a low growl. "Every person in that room who isn't blinded by his stock price knows it." "He knows everything about me, May," Clara whispered. "Every vulnerability I ever shared with him." "He knows the old Clara," Maya corrected, turning to face her. "The one who curated museums instead of her own life. It's time he met the new one." When they returned to the ballroom, Leo was surrounded by admirers. He was magnetic, a star in his own universe. Maya, a journalist with the instincts of a shark, watched him, her eyes narrowed, already formulating a plan. Clara's lawyer, a formidable woman named Julianne Croft, whom Maya had insisted on hiring, began her work the next morning. "Julianne," Clara said, her voice shaking, "how much did you know about my husband's finances?" Julianne's office overlooked the San Francisco Bay. "On paper, I know he's worth $900 million. I know he founded one of the most successful AI companies on the planet. I know his public image is pristine. I also know that men like Leo Vance don't build empires without creating shadows." Over the next few weeks, Julianne and a team of forensic accountants started digging. "Did Leo ever talk about his long-term financial plans with you?" Julianne asked. "Constantly," Clara replied. "For months before we decided to have a baby, it was all he talked about. Securing the future, creating a dynasty. He was obsessed with it." Julianne leaned forward. "What did he say, exactly?" Clara closed her eyes, the memory turning sour. He told me that his greatest fear was building something so massive only to have it fall apart. He said he was restructuring, creating trusts and new ventures to protect our family's future. I thought it was for us, for the baby. Julianne's expression was grim. He was protecting a future, all right, just not yours. She opened a sleek, digital file on the large monitor in her office. For the last 18 months, Leo Vance has been meticulously documenting a new life, funneling assets into it with your unwitting support. He hired wealth managers. He consulted with tax attorneys. He documented everything. Julianne clicked open the first file. "We'd like to present our findings," Julianne said, as if they were in a courtroom and not her minimalist office. Leo's lead attorney, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a condescending smirk, scoffed. "We haven't had a chance to review any of this alleged material." Julianne smiled, a predator's smile. "You had 18 months to hide it, Mr. Thorne. I think we can take an hour to review it now." The screen glowed, illuminating a devastating breadcrumb trail. 18 months of encrypted messages between Leo and Serena, discussing not just their affair, but their future. A detailed business plan for a boutique AI firm with Serena listed as the sole proprietor, funded by a series of shell corporations. Blueprints for a custom-built home in Napa Valley, a property Clara had never even heard of. Voicemails from Leo to Serena, retrieved from a deep-dive data recovery, talking about their child and their legacy. The office was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city traffic below. It was the suffocating quiet of a world collapsing. Then came the financials. $68 million, systematically diverted from Leo's personal investment funds into untraceable accounts. The accounts were all linked to a holding company registered in Serena's name. There were wire transfers to offshore banks, luxury car purchases, and down payments on commercial real estate. Leo's CFO, a man named Ethan Shaw, had his digital signature on every single transfer. He had helped Leo create a shadow budget, approving phantom expenses and falsifying quarterly reports to hide the outflow of cash. The chief financial officer of Vance AI had been Leo's partner in deception for nearly 2 years. Thorne was on his feet, his face flushed. "This is an outrageous fabrication. It's slander." Julianne's voice was as cool and sharp as ice. "It was verified by 2 of the top forensic accounting firms in the country, Mr. Thorne. Their affidavits are attached. It was also of great interest to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which has just opened a formal inquiry." Leo, sitting beside his lawyer, went pale. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with shock, not remorse. Then Julianne played the audio file. The speakers hissed for a second, and then Serena's voice filled the room, confident and clear from a call she had made to a friend. "He's going to leave her after the baby is born. He said it would be cleaner that way, less of a PR nightmare. He told me he feels nothing for her anymore, that the pregnancy was just an obligation he had to see through. He said I was the one who understood his vision, his ambition. I'm going to make sure that when this is over, Clara gets nothing. Because Clara is just a chapter in his life he's ready to close. She was the comfortable choice, but I'm the right one." There was a long silence. Clara sat perfectly still, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Her hands were clasped tightly on top of her baby bump. "Leo," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I wasn't ambitious enough for you. I should have been stronger. I should have fought for your attention. Please forgive me. And please don't let Serena take one more thing that belongs to my child." The recording ended. The silence in the room was absolute. Leo stood up. "That's been manipulated. That's not what she meant. It's out of context." Julianne looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It was recovered from a cloud server your company pays for on April 3rd of this year. It has been authenticated by 3 certified audio forensic specialists. And Mr. Vance, you have 17 more just like it. Would you like me to play them all?" Thorne didn't wait for his client's answer. He leaned over and whispered frantically in Leo's ear. An hour later, the preliminary settlement was drafted. Leo Vance would cede all claims to their shared properties and establish a trust for the child that was untouchable. Clara would receive a settlement that effectively gave her controlling interest in half of his liquid assets. Clara closed her eyes. There was no victory, no joy, just the quiet, steady rhythm of her own breathing, a sensation she hadn't felt in months. Just breath. 2 months of quiet. That was what Clara got. 60 days that felt like learning to walk again after a crippling injury. She sold the sprawling, sterile mansion overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, a house full of ghosts and Leo's minimalist taste. She wasn't ready for that kind of emptiness. She bought a charming Victorian in a quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood in Marin County, a place with a garden and rooms that felt like they could hold laughter. Maya became her rock. Every morning she would arrive with pastries and a laptop, and they would sit in Clara's sunlit kitchen while Maya explained the media strategy, fielding calls from reporters, and crafting the narrative of a dignified woman rebuilding her life. Vance AI wasn't one company. It was a behemoth with tendrils in every corner of modern life. Clara wanted nothing to do with it. Her empire would be different. Your husband didn't just build a company, Maya told her one morning. He built a myth around himself. Now you get to build your own. Clara's first board meeting was terrifying. It took place in a small, rented office space with 3 people, herself, Maya, and a financial advisor. She felt their doubt, a palpable, unspoken question of whether she was up to the task of managing such immense wealth. She didn't pretend to be an expert. "I don't know the first thing about venture capital," she said, her voice clear and steady, "but I know art. I've spent 15 years in a world where value is subjective, but authenticity is everything. You learn very quickly who is passionate and who is just playing a part. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to invest. I'm going to listen. And I'm going to back people whose vision I believe in. I promise you this. I will not invest a single dollar in something I don't understand." The room was quiet. Then Maya, sitting beside her, started to clap. A slow, deliberate sound. Clara's first major action was to establish a foundation that provided grants to emerging female artists, the kind of talent that was often overlooked by the mainstream art world. She called the first recipient herself, a young painter from Oakland who burst into tears on the phone. "My landlord was going to evict me next month. I didn't know how I was going to keep my studio." Clara said, "Keep it." Maya called that night. "So, how was your first day as the Medici of Marin County?" "Terrifying. I made a sculptor from Berkeley weep because I told her she could afford to quit her bartending job." "See," Maya said, "you're already better at this than Leo. He made people cry for entirely different reasons. This is progress." Clara laughed, a genuine, bubbling laugh that felt foreign and wonderful. It was like discovering a hidden part of herself she thought had been lost forever. She had her 32-week ultrasound with Maya holding her hand. The technician moved the wand over her belly, and a perfect, tiny profile appeared on the screen. A baby girl? Her baby girl. Her fingers, her toes, and a strong, steady heartbeat that echoed in the quiet room. A rhythm of a new life. A future that was entirely her own. Maya held the 3D ultrasound picture to the window. "She already has your determined chin. And look at that clenched fist. That's my goddaughter coming into this world ready for a fight." Elara slid the photo into her wallet, placing it next to the faded image of her parents on a trail in Yosemite. 2 generations of Sterling women, one lost too soon, one who had endured, and one just beginning her journey. The market stabilized, with investors cautiously optimistic about the new leadership. A local magazine ran a profile piece titled "The Archivist Who Inherited Silicon Valley and Chose Soul." Reading it in bed that night while eating gelato from the container, Elara felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. It was a foolish feeling. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the judge's ruling. Elara was in her father's sprawling office overlooking the bay, trying to make sense of investment portfolios, when Elias walked in without knocking. He never entered without knocking. "We have a serious problem," he said. Marcus Webb, the CFO, had not been idle. He had spent the last 3 weeks building a rebellion from within, quietly and methodically. With the frantic energy of a man cornered, Liam Vance knew that if anyone ever audited his offshore accounts, his life was over. He had paid a psychiatrist at a private clinic in Sausalito to forge a file suggesting Ava's father, Julian Sterling, had been in a state of severe mental decay for months. He had swayed two key investors, men who owed their fortunes to Isabel's influence, to back his play for an emergency takeover. And he had carefully leaked a tip to a well-known tech gossip columnist questioning Ava's stability. But the real betrayal was discovering how it all began. Reviewing the security schematics for the main estate, Ava had idly checked the live feed from the vineyard cameras. She saw Liam and Isabel, her own stepmother, standing far too close. She clicked on the audio feed. Their words, "a quiet conspiracy to brand her as unfit," echoed in her ears. The headline broke on a tech blog just minutes later. "Pregnant and pressured. Is Sterling Innovations too much for its grieving heiress?" The piece was poison, not for what it said, but for what it implied. Unwed, no partner on record, emotionally compromised, prone to erratic decisions. It painted her as a woman adrift in a sea of grief and hormones, completely incapable of steering a $100 billion tech empire. Ava's phone vibrated. "Isabel?" She answered on instinct. "Darling." Isabel's voice was a warm, sticky performance of concern she had honed over 16 years of marriage to her father. "I just saw that awful story. I'm so worried for you. A single mother running a company of this magnitude, it's an impossible burden. Julian would have wanted what's best for the child." Ava ended the call, her hands trembling. Isabel immediately called back. Ava ignored it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The emergency board meeting was a slaughter. Liam presented his argument with the rehearsed sincerity of a seasoned actor, citing her emotional fragility, the stress of the pregnancy, her lack of recent corporate experience. He presented it all as deep, profound concern. "We are not trying to oust Ava," he claimed. "We are merely proposing a temporary leave of absence to safeguard the company during this volatile period." The vote was 6-4 against her. Security guards she had known since she was a teenager escorted her from the Sterling Tower. She stood on the curb, 8 months pregnant, clutching a box with her personal effects. A small silver architectural model of her first building design slipped from the box, its delicate spire breaking on the sidewalk. She just stared at the fractured metal on the concrete. The dream it represented now shattered. Cars streamed past, the sounds of San Francisco a relentless, indifferent roar. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your inbox." It was a message from Isabel's lawyers. A formal offer. Isabel would assume full control of Sterling Innovations. Ava would get a monthly allowance of $50,000 and a penthouse apartment. In return, she would renounce all claims to the company and sign an unbreakable non-disclosure agreement. $50,000 a month. It was an insult. It was table scraps. It was chump change brushed from the gilded floors of an empire that was hers by right. At the end of the email, in tiny font, "This offer will expire in 72 hours. Isabel was giving her 3 days to surrender. That evening, Ava sat in her friend Chloe's tiny guest room in the Mission District. It was all gone. The company, her home, the future she had been designing for her child. Her phone rang. The screen glowed with Liam's name. She should have thrown it against the wall, but at 3 a.m, 8 months pregnant, in a borrowed room with your entire world stolen from you, you don't always make the smart choice. "Ava." His voice was broken, uncertain, a pathetic imitation of the confident charmer she thought she knew. "I know what Isabel did. I know about the plan." "Ava, I'm so sorry. She promised me everything, $200,000 and a board seat. I was weak. I was an idiot. I want to make it right. I'll go to the board. I'll tell them the truth." Ava shut her eyes. She wanted to believe him. Every exhausted, betrayed piece of her soul screamed to believe that someone, anyone, was telling her the truth. "Meet me," Liam pleaded. "I'll lay it all out. That little cafe in North Beach, the one we loved, tomorrow at noon." She agreed. It was a mistake. When Ava arrived at the cafe the next day, the press was already there. At least 8 photographers and 4 news vans. Liam was standing near the door, hands shoved in his pockets. The moment he saw her, his look of feigned despair told her everything. He had sold her out. Again. The headlines that night were brutal. Disgraced heiress in secret meeting with fiancé who ousted her. Reconciliation or collusion. Within hours, Isabel's lawyers had filed a new motion. The photographs they claimed were proof that Ava and Liam had been in cahoots the whole time, a scheme to defraud the estate. Ava sat in Chloe's apartment alone that night. Chloe was at work. The only sounds were the hum of the old refrigerator and the groan of the building. She picked up the broken architectural model from the floor, its delicate frame now spider-webbed with cracks. "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." It was her father's favorite saying. "Dad," she whispered to the empty room, "I can't do this. I'm not strong like you." The apartment offered no reply. The dead have no advice for the living. And then the baby kicked. A hard, sharp jab, a tiny foot pressing against her ribs with a power that felt impossible for a being that weighed less than 4 pounds. "Get up," the kick seemed to insist. "Get up, Mom. We are not done." Arthur Finch, her father's lawyer, arrived at Chloe's apartment at 7 the next morning. He looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. His tie was loose, which for Arthur was a sign of complete emotional collapse. But his eyes were sharp, glittering with an energy that Ava slowly recognized as excitement. "Your father," Arthur said, placing his worn leather briefcase on the kitchen table, "was the most brilliant man I've ever met, and also the most deeply paranoid. As it turns out, that paranoia was his most brilliant trait." Ava poured him a coffee, her hands no longer shaking. The baby's kick had dislodged something inside her, some final, lingering shred of self-pity. When she had woken up that morning, it was gone, replaced by something colder, clearer, and far more dangerous. Purpose. "Tell me," she said. Arthur opened his briefcase. Julian didn't have just one succession plan. He had 3. Ava sat down. "The first plan is the one everyone knows, the one that gave you controlling interest. That was the public face. That was the bait." "The bait for what?" "For this. For exactly this. For Isabel's power grab, the coup, the attempt to force you out and install herself." Arthur slid a thick, bound document across the table. "This was filed under a judicial seal with the Northern District Court of California 14 months ago. It has a single activation trigger, the successful and hostile removal of a designated heir which grants temporary control of Sterling Innovations to a non-designated party." "What does it activate?" "A protocol. A full forensic data audit. Not corporate, not state, federal, SEC, Department of Justice, and the IRS. Every digital transaction made by Sterling Innovations for the past 20 years. Every server, every backup, every encrypted message." Ava stared at him, the reality of it sinking in. "By winning," Arthur said with a grim smile, "Isabel just lit the fuse. It was the forgery that doomed her, you see. That's the key. Had the challenge to the estate been based in some semblance of reality, filed with clean hands by a person acting in good faith, the protocol would have stayed dormant. But the Damascus Protocol had specific triggers: falsified corporate documents, attempts to bribe board members, digital signature manipulation. Isabella hit the trifecta. She basically signed the warrant for her own audit." The tea grew cold in Chloe's mug. She was too absorbed to notice. "And the rest of the data?" she asked. Arthur, for the first time in the week she'd known him, looked genuinely moved. His expression hardened, his eyes glistening with a strategist's pride. "The rest," he said, "is a private server Julian curated himself. It holds every piece of evidence he gathered over the last 3 years of his life. Encrypted emails, transaction logs, recordings of phone calls, sworn digital affidavits from developers who quit. It's irrefutable proof that David Chen and Isabella Vance have been committing intellectual property theft, embezzlement, and wire fraud since 2021. "He knew," Chloe whispered. "He knew she'd fight dirty. He knew she would try to steal his life's work. So he built a fortress that could only be opened from the inside, with the key of her own greed." Arthur leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished table. "Your husband designed this so that the more aggressively Isabella moved, the more irrevocably she would trap herself. Every proxy she coerced, every document she backdated, every share she illegally transferred. It all became another log entry in the evidence file. She's been building the SEC's case against herself for months. Chloe reached for a cracked tablet on the side table, a prototype they had designed together. The screen lit up with his favorite coding comment, etched into the login screen. Integrity is the one variable you can't fake. He planned for me to be pushed out, she said, her voice a low hum of realization. Arthur nodded. He planned for you to be underestimated. Anyone can lead from a position of strength, Chloe. He wanted to know if you still had the fire to fight when your back was against the wall. And you did, every step of the way. Chloe set the tablet down and met Arthur's gaze. How long until the SEC freezes their assets? It's already done. Federal agents have had a mirror of Ether Dynamics servers since 6 a.m. this morning. Does Isabella know? Not a whisper? Chloe stood, walked to the window overlooking the bay, and squared her shoulders. Call an emergency board meeting, she said, tomorrow morning. Full attendance required, no remote access. Arthur watched her, a slow smile spreading across his face. What's the agenda? I'm going to finish what my husband started. The boardroom of Ether Dynamics was on the 50th floor of the titanium and glass spire Julian had raised from the heart of San Francisco. On a day like this, you could see the Farallon Islands. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Isabella, naturally, was there first. She sat in the CEO's chair, a position she'd held for less than a month, and radiated an aura of absolute victory. David Chen stood at her shoulder, scrolling through market projections on his device like a man who believed the game was already over. 3 board members who had sided with her sat looking smug, confident their gamble had paid off. The door slid open at 10 a.m. on the dot. Chloe entered, 8.5 months pregnant, in a simple black dress. No purse, no files, no entourage. Just Chloe and Arthur, who held a single encrypted hard drive no bigger than his thumb. Isabella's smile was pure condescension. This meeting is for the current executive team, darling. Chloe didn't even look at her. She walked to the holographic presentation table in the center of the room, inserted the drive, and hit the activation button. The holographic displays around the room flared to life like portals into a corporate underworld, a decade of financial data, visualized. Every shell corporation Isabella had registered in Delaware, organized by date with routing numbers and transaction logs. Every illegal transfer of intellectual property David had authorized matched to the shell company that received it. Every forged digital signature on Julian's health directives displayed next to the authentic biometric data, the discrepancies glowing in crimson, every offshore account, every slush fund, every undeclared asset, every single dollar of the $73 million they had systematically siphoned from the company Julian Croft built from a single line of code. David shot to his feet. Where did you get this? Arthur's voice was perfectly level. From the man who coded the very system you used for your theft, and he included a failsafe you never found. The hologram shifted. New documents materialized in the air. The unsealed Damascus Protocol, the official SEC order that had been triggered at dawn, the federal warrants already served. A timeline showed that federal agents had entered the building at 8 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting. They were already here, downstairs in the finance department, in David's office, in the main server farm. They had been crawling through the company's digital guts all morning, and no one who knew had any reason to raise the alarm. Isabella stood, her face the color of wet cement, the same shade it had been at Julian's memorial when an old colleague had openly questioned her new authority. But this time there was no escape, no plausible deniability, no backdoor. You can't, she stammered, her voice fraying. I'll sue. I'll get an injunction. You'll what, Isabella? Chloe's voice was quiet, but it filled the space. Not angry, not triumphant, just present. Humiliate me in front of our colleagues again? The room fell deathly silent. Every person there remembered the last product launch, the sound of Isabella's mocking laughter as she called Chloe a has-been. Chloe went on. 7 years. You spent 7 years stealing from him. You stole his ideas, you stole his trust, you stole his money. You tried to convince a sick man that the woman carrying his child didn't care about his legacy. And 3 weeks ago, you tried to steal his company. She let her gaze sweep across the room, over the complicit board members, over David, who was now openly weeping, and finally landing back on Isabella, whose hands shook uncontrollably. But you forgot one thing, Chloe said. My husband didn't build this for you. He built it for me. And he spent the last 3 years of his life coding a ghost in the machine to make damn sure that no matter what you did, no matter how clever you thought you were, no matter how many people you lied to or paid off, the truth would execute. Because that's the man he was. She placed a hand on her pregnant belly, where a tiny foot was kicking. And that's the woman I am. The boardroom doors slid open. 2 FBI agents entered, then 4 more. They were professional, quiet, and moved with a sense of finality. David Chen was cuffed first. He sobbed incoherently as they read him his rights, the messy, pathetic tears of a man who was convinced he was the smartest person in any room and had just learned he wasn't even in the game. Isabella was cuffed second. She didn't make a sound. She stood perfectly rigid as the agent clicked the restraints into place, her eyes locked on Chloe the entire time. Her expression was a complex algorithm of pure hatred, frantic calculation, and something else. Something Chloe had never seen on Isabella's face before. The blank, hollow shock of utter defeat. Security escorted her toward the exit. Isabella stopped. The guards waited. He was in love with you, Isabella said, her voice a low murmur. I saw it. I always did. I just figured if I could erase you, his love would have to go somewhere. It would have to find me. She took a breath. It doesn't work like that, does it? No, Clara replied. It doesn't. Isabella gave a single, bitter nod, and then they led her out into the San Francisco fog. The 2 investors who had backed Julian's new venture pulled their funding before noon. They weren't sued, but their reputations in the culinary world were finished. Julian Vance was served divorce papers for infidelity and fraud the next morning. He called Clara's phone 23 times from his lawyer's office. She never picked up. There is a moment, wedged between the explosion and the silence, when the weight you've been carrying for so long finally shatters, and you're just left standing in the quiet, lighter than you ever thought you could be. Clara felt it that afternoon, sitting alone in her lawyer's office for the first time since the reveal, the room smelling of paper and a faint, sharp scent of justice. Her lawyer brought her a tablet, the final piece of discovery from Julian's cloud account. Inside was a folder with 212 photos. Each file was labeled with a date and a location, all in Julian's meticulous style. 2 years of trips, every food festival, every sourcing trip, every random Wednesday when Julian was supposedly scouting a new location, he had taken Isabella with him. Clara opened the first one, dated 6 months after Isabella was hired. An image of them laughing on a vineyard in Napa. The caption read, "Finally, someone who gets it." Clara scrolled to the next, and the next, and the next. She looked at them for 3 days. She wept through most of it. A deep, cleansing grief for 2 years of lies. Tears that left her feeling hollowed out and raw, like a shoreline after a hurricane. Battered, but still there. She saved them all to a secure hard drive next to a digital photo of her mother. 2 women who taught her strength, one who was gone, one who was on her way. Clara went into labor on a Tuesday morning during a deposition. Her water broke mid-sentence, right as she was detailing the fraudulent catering invoices, which her best friend Maya later said was poetic justice. Maya drove 90 miles an hour in her vintage convertible, which was absolutely not built for that kind of speed. I did 1 rotation in labor and delivery in college, Maya yelled over the wind, and I am not delivering this baby on the Golden Gate Bridge. Just drive, Maya. Julian's father followed in a black sedan, on the phone with the hospital director, demanding the best suite, the best pediatrician, and a private security detail, which Clara had not asked for but which he insisted was non-negotiable. Maya, his voice crackled through the car's speakers, "You've run 4 red lights, 5, she yelled back. The last one was definitely yellow. Stella Marie Vance was born at 8:22 p.m., weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had Clara's dark hair and her grandmother's determined gaze, and a grip so strong it made the nurse chuckle and say, "Oh, this one's going to be a fighter." Clara held her daughter in the quiet hospital room as the last bit of daylight faded over the bay, turning everything to gold. Her father-in-law stood in the doorway, hands clasped, his face etched with a regret so deep it was the first and only time Clara would ever see him cry. Maya was crashed out in the visitor's armchair, still in the yoga pants she'd been wearing that morning, snoring gently. On the nightstand, in a new silver frame with a tiny crack still visible at the bottom, sat her mother's favorite quote: "Integrity is the only recipe that can't be stolen." Clara looked at her daughter's face, so tiny, so new, so blissfully unaware of the scandal that awaited her. The fortune tied up in her name, the quiet war that was waged before she drew her first breath. "Your father was a brilliant chef," Clara whispered, "but your grandmother was the most honest person I ever knew. And your mama, she was an art historian who fell for a beautiful lie. And you, little one," she said, "you are the reason the truth matters." Stella yawned, a tiny, perfect, world-changing yawn. Clara smiled. Not for the tabloids that would be clamoring for a picture tomorrow, not for the lawyers who would need her statement on Monday, not for the multi-million-dollar restaurant empire she never wanted, but would now have to dismantle. She smiled because her daughter was here, because the photos had been found, because the truth had finally been served, the way her mother always said it would be. And because for the first time in her life, Clara Vance was no longer just a supporting character. Outside the hospital window, the city of San Francisco glittered, its cars and lights and lives all moving relentlessly forward. The Vance culinary brand was broken, the cracked frame of their perfect life was shattered, and somewhere, in whatever empty soundproofed kitchen brilliant but broken men go, Julian Vance was finally alone. His wife was free. This is a story about the cost of a lie and the return on truth. It is about the people who build their lives on solid ground and the hollow price paid by those who build theirs for an audience. If you have ever been gaslit, taken for granted, or made to feel like a footnote in your own life, this story was written for you. If you are ready, stay with me. This is going to change the way you see the perfect couples on your social media feed. And if this story resonates with you, do me one favor. Hit that follow button. Leave a comment telling me what city you are listening from, and share this with one person who needs to be reminded of their own strength today. Because stories like this do not just entertain, they remind us what we are made of. This content was meticulously researched, written, and produced by our team to bring you powerful narratives with real-world lessons. Every word was chosen with intention because we know that meaningful stories are more important than ever. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of this community.